Lectures were given by fellows of the Indian Academy of Sciences who are located in Pune. But even though they are in Pune, their work has spanned the whole country and in many cases the whole world. And we hope to open out a treasure house to you by introducing these fellows to a wide audience. Now, today's speaker, Madhav Gadgil, will be introduced by my colleague, Surendra Raskarbi, but I would just like to say a few words about him. So he is one the leading environmentalist and behavioral scientist of the country. He has worked on a large number of things. I first met him when I was a student of gravitation theory in TIFR and I visited the Center for Theoretical Studies in Bangalore. So just a couple of years before that, he had been brought in specially. He and his wife, Professor Sulochana Gati, had been brought in by Professor ECG Sudarshan to set up two completely new fields in India. One would be animal behavior, and the other, and Sulochana would be contributing to the already established field of atmospheric science. So I had the privilege of knowing Madhav at a very young age, and then I met many of his students, several of whom now have become very leading workers in the field and have graced very high positions. And I had the privilege of going to the jungles with Madhav Gadgil and his students from time to time and fell in love with those subjects. So I'll now leave it to Surendra Raskarbi to introduce him in detail. Thank you very much.
Good morning, all of you. It's indeed a pleasure to have Professor Gadgil as our speaker today, and I'll introduce him briefly. He has done so many things, but I'll mention some. I'll give some of the highlights. Professor Madhav Gadgil is an ecologist, academic, writer, columnist, and the founder of the Center of Ecological Sciences, a research forum under the aegis of Indian Institute of Science. He is a former member of the Scientific Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India and the head of Western Ghats Ecology Expert Panel of 2010, popularly known as the Gadgil Commission. He is a recipient of the Volvo Environment Prize and the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement. The Government of India awarded him the fourth highest civilian award of Padma Shri in 1981 and followed it up with the third highest civilian award of Padma Bhushan in 2006. Dr. Gadgil did his doctoral research at Harvard University on mathematical ecology and fish behavior under the guidance of William Bossert, one of T.B. Wilson's former students. After completing his PhD in 1969, he received a fellowship from IBM to continue his work as a research fellow at the Harvard Computing Center and simultaneously worked as a lecturer of biology at the university for 2 years. In 1973, he joined the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, starting an association that would stretch over 30 years and superannuating from the institute in 2004. During this period, he established two research centers at IISc, the Center of Theoretical Studies and the Center for Ecological Studies. He also worked as a visiting professor at Stanford in 1991 and University of California at Berkeley in 1995. After his retirement from IISc, he went back to Pune in 2004. He has assisted the efforts to establish the first biosphere reserve in the country at the Nilgiris in 1986. In 1988, he was appointed the chairman of the Science and Technology Advisory Panel of Global Environment Facility, an agency under the United Nations. He held the chair of this particular facility until 2002. He also served as a member of the Environmental Education Panel of the National Council of Science, Education, Research and Training, or NCERT, and as a member of the National Prof, National Conservation and the chairman at Tool. And he has been extraordinarily vocal about issues and problems in ecology, environment, and conservation. With this very brief introduction, I now invite Professor Gadgil to deliver his talk. Over to you, Professor Gadgil.
Thank you very much. Dr. Navi and Dr. Gadgil. It is my privilege to be with you and this knowledge cluster and talk about a topic which I am fascinated by and interested in, conserving biodiversity. But I am a scientist and I want to view this whole question of conserving biodiversity in the perspective of a scientist, because I believe that it is science in the most progressive, most democratic of all endeavors, and we should follow the tendency, the ideas of how science should operate in talking about any question. Now, when we come up with this notion of conserving biodiversity, there are two completely diametric approaches which are being advocated in the country today, almost as religions. One is that we must protect all wildlife come what may. If tigers are roaming around the countryside and eating people, and elephants are roaming around countryside and trampling people, it does not matter. We must protect them. On the contrary, there is another approach that let all nature go to hell. All that matters is gross domestic product. And we must keep increasing it and increasing it and increasing it. It may be polluting the site, doing all sorts of other things. Certainly, at serious cost to biodiversity, it does not matter. Now, I think it's wrong, certainly personally, would not want to, for these kind of extreme, almost religious approaches to be followed. And that is why I want to talk about. Why? Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Why we should conserve biodiversity. How do we set about conserving biodiversity? These are, to my mind, important issues. And as I said, as a scientist, I am particularly impressed by works of two people, ideas of two people. One of them is J.D. Mandal, who one of the early crystallographers, one may call him the founder of molecular biology. And Mandal was interested in broader issues. He wrote on social functions of science. He defined science as a systematic enterprise of skepticism. We must be skeptical about everything. We must not take anything for granted, whether it is the religion, as I said, of we must protect every tiger in the country, or the religion of we must celebrate our GDP growth rate growing from 6 to 7 and be sad if it has declined to 4. These are, I think, as I said, issues one must skeptically examine. What is the point in all this? And the second is the mathematician, philosopher Whitehead, who also thought about science and wrote this very interesting book, Science in the Modern World. And his edict that I think is very valuable for me, at least personally, is that science must anchor itself to objective facts, however unpalatable those facts may be. That we should face them and we should then make decisions. Next slides, please. So, as an ecologist, also with an interest in evolution, what is it that conserving biodiversity involves? We call it, in our scientific discipline, ecological prudence. All other animals live in here and now. They have no notion, they do not operate in somewhere else, and certainly not in past and future. But man has symbolic language, and with the help of this symbolic language and elaborated knowledge, so we can visualize past and future here as well as elsewhere. We can visualize long-term consequences of our actions, and occasionally at least, humans can overcome their selfish tendencies and act in group interests. Uh, there are some interesting scientific papers also on this. Are there any prudent animals? Laboratory has an interesting posed this question, and the answer is that no. Only humans are a prudent species. Next slide, please. And why do we exercise prudence? Because we perceive that other than humans, other elements, of course, humans also, as I said, humans are special in that we do not live confined within groups. So here we are, none of us perhaps related to each other in any way, sharing ideas with each other. So we interact with wide range of groups, and humans perceive the non-human elements, the plants, animals, rivers, hills, forests, as benefiting them and as deserving to be some return benefits, so to say, from us. And these return benefits that we may confer on these natural limits may be in terms of absolute protection or restraints on exploiting them. But why? Why do we want to do this? Basically, it is to ensure that the ecosystem services that these elements are providing us continue. Next slide, please. We, in that sense, think of us being part of a community of beings. This is an interesting term. People have said that there are historians who are interested in these issues I'm talking about. There being two views of life. One is that you are part of a community of beings, and the other is that we are in a dominion of man, and man can and should dominate everything else, and if necessary, destroy it. The older civilizations all over the world, in fact, had this view of community of beings. And of course, this is captured in this saying for Upanishads, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and it is inscribed in the entrance hall of Indian Parliament. So we are part of this point of view. But being part of community of beings has never meant not hunting. After all, humans originated 3 lakh years ago as hunters, group hunters, and have been hunting ever since. Next slide, please. So we hunt, but hunt with restraint to ensure ecosystem services. Not far from Bengaluru, where I lived for a long time, is this village of Pukre, Vellore, off Mysore Road. Pukre means storks, Vellore means the good village. So the name of the village itself is the good village of storks. And it's a remarkable village. In the middle of the village, agricultural village, are old, large tamarind trees, and all those tamarind trees are full of nests of painted stork and grey pelican, as you will see here. And the services that these painted storks and grey pelicans are providing is that they bring fish from nearby ponds to feed their young, and their droppings and the fish that fall down make for a great fertilizer, and the villagers value the fertilizer. So throughout the breeding season, they will not disturb this, they will not touch them. But once the breeding is over, outside the breeding season, they hunt them, because then disturbing them and hunting them in small numbers does not deplete them, and presumably over many centuries it never depleted them, because apparently this name of the village has persisted for centuries. Next slide, please. Now, but while our society perhaps therefore might have been at balance and at peace with nature, it certainly was not at peace with each other, with other humans. There is this famous episode of Khandava, burning of the Khandava forest, Khandava Tahana in Mahabharata, in which Krishna and Arjuna have gone round this large forest where today Delhi is located, and killed everything that came out of the forest that was set on fire, not only all the animals, but also the Naga Adivasis. So it was a society not at peace with people, but it was a society at peace with nature. Next slide, please. In this society was born Gautama Buddha. It's a remarkable individual. I think he's the world's first rationalist. Here are his sayings. Believe nothing, no matter where you read it or who has said it, not even if I have said it, unless it agrees with your own reason and your common sense. So he said humans should stop believing in the Paurusheya Vedas and divine knowledge, and must look at what they see. Interestingly enough, he obtained his enlightenment sitting under a banyan tree. The banyan tree, ecologists consider it as an important keystone resource which supports many other species. And as he received his enlightenment, he pointed at the earth, saying all knowledge has come from the earth, from actual observations of this world, which is, of course, the hallmark of science. And he preached that there be not only peace with nature, but also peace among people. Next slide, please. So, reason, as I said, is of course what we must, and science says we must adhere to, but decisions such as whether we want to protect wildlife, as I said, even if the elephants eat people, and even if the if tigers eat people and elephants trample people or not, is a matter of value. And as I already mentioned, I think the two extreme philosophies which are going around in this India at least, and in many parts of the world, are to be rejected, of wildlife at all costs or GDP growth at all costs. Next slide, please. So, but people who are part of this community of beings, as what they say, this kind of culture, they value nature's services. Not far from where we are sitting, I guess in Pune here, is near the Western Ghats, about 25 kilometers as the crow flies directly to the west, in the catchment of the Panchayat Dam in Leh Taluka. Here is this magnificent sacred gram of Mangaon. And I spent some days in Mangaon village talking to them. The villagers value the services of this sacred gram. They are aware that it is providing a number of ecosystem services, it is safeguarding the stream in the village, it is supplying leaf litter, medicinal plant. They hunt animals, but outside. And they say other villages which don't have such sacred grounds have lost all barking deer, which they love to hunt and eat. But our sacred ground has a breeding population of barking deer. Once in a while, some get out. surplus gets out, then we hunt and eat them happily. But inside the forest, we will not touch them. And it's a service, so to say, for us from this forest. You can see how devastated the remaining landscape is. And the myth in the urban circles is that it is the imprudent, ignorant villages have destroyed all these catchments. But the reality is, and I have actually personally witnessed the corruption of forest department in sitting in this Mangaon village. It is the corrupt engineers and forest department officials which have been responsible for the destruction of the catchments in every one of the reservoirs on our Sahyadris. Next slide, please. Now, interestingly enough, when I and my guru, botanist guru, Dr. Vartak, we were working on these sacred grounds, I got a letter from a village called Gani in Srivardhan Taluka in Ratnagiri, I guess, district. And they asked us to come and save their sacred ground. And they said they went to the local forest ranger, and forest ranger said, no, my bosses have asked me to cut it down, but if you can get orders changed, and maybe Madhav Gadgil can do that, and I've heard of them, then I will stop cutting. So we went there, and the villagers were insistent of guarding that, again, for a variety of ecosystem services, this ground they must make sure is not cut down. So Vartakala went to the boss of the forest department and asked him, and he said, well, since you are making this foolish request, I will agree to it, but these sacred grounds are nothing but stands of over-mature timber. They deserve to be cleared. So that is how the villagers understood and wanted to retain ecosystem services. The commercially oriented forest department trashed these ecosystem services. Next slide, please. All the result of all this were the India's village communities. Although there were many inequalities within the communities, caste and other serious, grave, unfortunate inequalities, but they have garnered and sustainably used the living resources of all the common lands of the country. There is plenty of documentary evidence. The early British travelers talk of India being an ocean of trees teeming with wildlife. That is how the British discovered India. Next slide, please. But Britain, it had a very different heritage. The Christian heritage, which told them that all-powerful God planned the full creation for man's benefit, and no item had any purpose except to serve man's purpose, and you can wipe it out if you wish. Next slide, please. So, what happened? The British history is interesting. In 1066, more than 1,000 years ago, William the Conqueror conquered England and established his kingdom, and with him were the aristocrats who could easily overpower the peasants, the common people, with their armory. And indeed, what happened was that William the Conqueror divided the entire country into fiefdoms of dukes and lords, and these dukes and lords, they enclosed all the common lands of the country, which, like in India, the people had protected. They were well forested and had a lot of wildlife, and the consequence of taking this forest away from the people was that Britain became disforested. Next slide. Then along with that, they also declare that it is the lords who can hunt. But if any commoner hunts, then they will punish him by hanging. Thousands and thousands of peasants, there is history between 10,066 to 14th century, were hanged as poachers, and their, as I said, common lands were taken over. Next slide, please. So by 14th century, Britain was completely without any forest cover or any larger wildlife. It only retained birds, basically, grouse and like our partridge and so on, as their wildlife in their country. Now the British, these were the British after 14th century, where they had no forest, no wildlife, which conquered India, and they wanted to now drain our resources. There is the famous book by Dadabhai Naoroji, Drain of India, where he talks about how systematically British set about draining India's resources. Most important, one of the major was village community lands, and the agency set up to take over and drain the tree crop on the village community lands was the forest department. Next slide, please. So, indeed, actually, British bureaucrats themselves, sympathetic to people, have written. There are letters from Revenue Commissioner of Madras Presidency at that time saying that forest department is doing is not conservation but confiscation. And forest department is talking about conserving liquidated forest on large scale. This is also historically well documented. Huge tracts were handed over to tea and coffee planters. Interestingly enough, I will come back to that. There are letters from tea and coffee planters saying that they must force people entirely out of the forest because otherwise they won't get any labor to work on their own plantations if villagers are allowed to continue using resources of the forest. And the forest department, of course, took steps to do that. Then the large areas of forest were destroyed to set up British cantonments. Then the railway lines came, and for sleepers and fuels, huge forest tracts were felled for ships of British Navy and gun carriages. And at the same time, they treated people like that and harassed them, extorted bribes, and at the same time supplying highly subsidized wood for railways, military, and industries. Next slide, please. Mahatma Gandhi, of course, had a different philosophy. He talked about India becoming a republic of self-reliant villages at peace with nature, and he wanted, and Congress had agreed before independence, that villagers will be handed back their forests, ending the confiscatory regime of the forest department. Next slide, please. But while paying lip service to Gandhi, which we continue to do today, we do not implement any of his ideas. So after independence came the new forest policy of 1952, which reaffirmed the hegemony of forest department. At the invitation of the Karnataka government, I did a study of the paper industry of Karnataka. One case study I just to illustrate. West Coast Paper Mill is a major industry, paper industry, and the government was giving them bamboo at 1.5 rupee a ton, and the basket weavers had to buy it at 1,500 rupees a ton, as opposed to what the paper mill got at 1.5 rupee a ton. The paper mill put barbed fencing around the forest completely illegally, and I have watched myself helplessly them beating up the villagers. It was their forest still then when this barbed wire came. But they were beaten up and driven out. And how did the bamboo was used? Actually, I got to know the managers well. They explained to me that look, we have got the bamboo essentially for free. We have license to pollute. It makes no sense for us to do anything else except to rapidly exhaust the bamboo. We are not really in the business of making paper, although you may think so. We are in the business of making money. We are making money at such a rate that all bamboo be exhausted. We will put our money in something else, such as mining for manganese, and move elsewhere. So what was this? Today, it is called crony capitalism. Crony capitalism is basically squeezing nature and squeezing the poorer people to fatten the rich. Next slide, please. And then there came a Wildlife Protection Act in 1972. So this act has extended the stranglehold on the forest department over the entire country instead of being confined only to forested areas. And one of their targets, and again I have personally witnessed this, was the Chipko activists of the Uttarakhand who were trying to protect the forest. And I must say, though I feel sometimes very uneasy talking about this, because Bombay Natural History Society and Sunny Valley were leaders in propagating this kind of an attitude. And Sunny Valley, of course, was my guru, and I became a field ecologist at his inspiration. But it was very clear that he was completely alienated from the Indian society and had this completely prejudiced view of people being the destroyers of nature. Next slide, please. Anyway, so as I said, my father, in fact, was a member of the society. He was very interested in bird watching much before I was born, and because he was a personal friend of Salim Ali, and so I met Salim Ali when I was quite young, and I decided to follow in his footsteps. And I spent a lot of time with him in the field for the next 25, 30 years. I did some joint research projects with him. But next slide, please. It was clear that he was in sympathy with the tea and coffee planters and their kind of philosophy of throwing people out. Again, many of these planters were brilliant naturalists and wrote very readable accounts. I enjoyed reading them as a school student in the Journal of Bombay Natural History Society. Two of the leading naturalists and very good writers were Morris of Karnataka and E.P.D. from Assam, both planters, both uniformly regarded common people of India in contact. And in fact, there are accounts, there are very moving fictional accounts, but supposedly many people have told me of how they are true. An account called Red Tea of how the planters actually treated the people on their plantations, laborers on their plantations, worse than slaves. Next slide, please. So, in the meanwhile, of course, before the Wildlife Protection Act came, Britishers went on a great hunting spree. And Salim Ali also went on a great hunting spree. From the age of 10, when he hunted this yellow-throated sparrow, which began his ornithological career, till probably 1972, he continued hunting. He hunted rhinoceros in Burma, and he hunted tigers in Mizoram, uh, I guess, or maybe Meghalaya, and uh, he was also a friend with the Bharatpur Maharaja, and of the Bharatpur Maharaja's wetland, the famous Bharatpur wetland. You have this big stone plaque you can see where the Viceroys of Britain, the Viceroy of India, Lord Linlithgow, he boasted of shooting no less than 4,273 water birds on a single day. Next slide, please. So, Salim Ali had been bringing birds at Bharatpur for a long time. But of course, he was a wonderful ornithologist and a field naturalist, but he had no view of the overall ecosystem and certainly no understanding of its how it functioned. And on basis of sheer prejudice, he decided that getting rid of buffaloes grazing in the wetland and other uses of by local people such as khas grass, those were destructive and it should be made a national park, and those people barred. The people protested and 7 died in police firing. Uh, but what happened was really surprising to me also. I also had no real understanding of that ecosystem, though I spent a lot of time with Salim in that bird ranking camps on Bharatpur. It was the buffaloes whose grazing was keeping the wetland in the condition it was very favorable for the water birds. Without grazing, the one particular weed, spalum, the Elysium, I think, it proliferated, it choked the wetland, converted it into a shallow, wet grassland, and water birds found left. It became so, this measure, which Salim Ali asked for being implemented, actually made the habitat worse for water birds. Now, Bombay Natural History Society had a continuing research program, and of course, they saw this. They wrote about these consequences, but it should have been made public. No, this team has submitted only a report to US Fish and Wildlife Service, never made these very relevant findings public. And I have asked recently, Vijay, my good friend, who was in charge of this follow-up studies, uh, has this been ever made available to the public, and why doesn't he do so? It has never been made available from 1984 or so till today. The finding that Salim Ali's prejudice was completely misplaced is never brought to proper public notice. Next slide, please. And we have a regime with this Wildlife Protection Act, which is talking as if conserving biodiversity, uh, especially of the larger wild mammals and birds and reptiles, is what counts. And I don't want to go into detail. You can see my student Ranjit Daniel and I, we did a research study on how much conservation value you should assign to various taxa. And even amongst the larger birds, mammals, reptiles, the ghadial is much more valuable than tiger and elephant. But ghadial is declining from at a very fast pace. There is no protection for it. There is no effort to save it. And why it is declining? Because the rivers are getting polluted in every way, including with arsenic, mercury, the stretches of river in which Gadiar today survives are full of this, and it is declining rapidly. Next slide, please. So, the question is how we should come. What is it that we should value? Is it just these few big animals, or entire range of biodiversity? And this is an important question. But today we are only talking about protecting tigers and rhinos and elephants and wild pigs, by the way. And I had personally been and worked and roamed in these forests where this poor lady who was killed by a tiger is lying today. And it really struck me that if I go again there, and there are these lone tribal youth who are my very good friends with whom I have done research in these forests, it is one of their sisters who was killed. And if I go out today with them, they also stand a chance of being killed. And if we protest, then we are criminals. We are criminals under Wildlife Protection Act. Next slide, please. And the most perverse is protection to the wild pigs. All over the country, these wild pigs are doing havoc to the fields. With the protection, they have spread to areas far away from forested areas. I have a friend who comes from Man Taluka in Satara district, where he said that till 10 years ago, there was not a single wild pig, and now in last 10 years, there is abundance of wild pigs. There is no forest area, no wildlife sanctuary anywhere near his village in Man Taluka, but the wild pigs are destroying crops, the farmers are helpless, and many are starting to abandon farming. Wild pigs have on occasion killed people. I talked about this Wildlife Protection Act with two good friends of mine. One is a retired Inspector General of Forest of Maharashtra, and another is a retired High Court judge. They said if you describe what the Wildlife Protection Act says, it is unconstitutional. Indian Penal Code says that if an assault by a wrongdoer reasonably causes the apprehension of death or grievous hurt or destruction of property, you can kill that wrongdoer. Other than human being, you can kill. But Wildlife Protection Act says you cannot kill a wild pig. And wild pig is something everybody, maybe there are vegetarians, of course, who don't eat it, but apart, so leaving them out, India, at least 80% are meat eaters, and all of them love to eat wild pig. Actually, wild pig is an important ingredient of recipes. There is a book of recipes from Nepal King's Palace. Wild pig is a major ingredient of delicacies served by Nepal king. So everybody eats them. But it is a crime if you even kill it while defending your property on the farm. Next slide, please. And this stranglehold has been used by the Forest Department, amongst other things, to ensure that the Uttarakhand's Vana Panchayats, which were the support of people's strength and of the Chipko and Molan, are dismantled. This has led to people becoming even weaker to resist encroachments and destruction of their habitat. And you have these whole range of environmentally degrading projects in the Uttarakhand, and there was this humongous landslide of 7th February this year, which killed a large number of people associated with one such forest. This year, only last week, I guess, there were reports of another big landslide in Himachal Pradesh in similar conditions, which again killed a lot of people. Next slide, please. And who is working in tandem with Bombay Naturalist Society to perpetuate this kind of a system? It is the World Wildlife Fund. World Wildlife Fund and Bombay Naturalist Society have many common members. and they have been working in tandem, and the record of World Wildlife Fund is very interesting. They have described a whole range of force down, in fact, whole range of projects on the down the throat of countries in East and South Africa and in India. In the East and South Africa, I actually in East Africa in Kenya, I have been to this Masai Mara, and the Masai Mara is a forest of the Masai people of Kenya. They were forcibly driven out. They have no voice in its management. Management is completely European. European tourism takes advantage of this. On the other hand, in the same African continent, there are game ranches. So there is this Burkina Faso one, Nazinga ranch, where Britishers go. Britishers go there, hunt, and they carry back trophies of these elephants, for instance, and many other wild animals. So this is what is being done in these other countries. Next slide. And in England, of course, they destroyed all their larger wildlife. But there are these grouse. And as with the other earlier system, it is the earls and so on, mostly the landlords of Britain, who have these shooting preserves. And the shooting estates, the estimate is that on every day of the year in Britain, 12,300 wild mammals and birds are killed on these shooting estates. And because birds of prey are supposed to be enemies of these grouse, they are killed deliberately, and Britain has been losing number of species of birds of prey. They are going extinct from Britain over the last 2 centuries. And the same British citizens are going trophy hunting to Africa. And the World Wildlife Fund, whose founder, one of the major voices was the Prince Philip, who recently expired, the husband of Queen Elizabeth. So they preached strict ban on hunting in India, including a ban on hunting wild pigs. And this is what is going on in Britain. And gullible Indians have been swallowing this, unfortunately. Next slide, please. And what is happening in our tiger reserves, which have been set up at the initiative of World Wildlife Fund? In Sarishka, in 2005, no more tigers were to be seen, whereas Forest Department claimed that there were 20 tigers still. So the Prime Minister set up a tiger task force. I served as a member of the tiger task force, and we were given a deposition by the Central Board of Investigation, this tiger task force. They said that, of course, the tigers had been poached out. There were none left by end of 2003, although Forest Department was claiming 20 are there. And the CBI said that the tigers had been poached, carcasses were lying skinned, were rotting, caused an incredible stink. It is impossible that the forest officers involved with Sarishka Tiger Reserve could not have noticed this poaching. They must have been party to the making money out of these tiger skins. This is what CBI clearly reported to our tiger task force. What happened on the ground? No forest officer was called to book. All the forest officers did was to go around the villages on the boundary of Sarishka, beating up villagers, saying they are the poachers. Next slide, please. So all this kind of fixation, all these big animals, in a sense, officially came to an end at the 1992 Earth Summit, Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit, where the Convention on Biological Diversity was signed by many countries, 143 countries, I understand. And India was, I think, the 5th country to sign it. Kamal Nath, our minister, rushed and signed. And so we accepted the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the convention clearly says that what we want is conservation, sustainable use, and equitable sharing of benefits flowing from the biodiversity. The conventional, the ecosystem principles that the convention has accepted emphasize the importance of knowledge and traditions and motivation of local people, and emphasize that they must have an important role in the follow-up activities to the Convention on Biological Diversity. But instead of actually implementing it through institutions which represent people, which are, of course, Gram Panchayats, Taluk Panchayat, Jilla Panchayats, these are representative institutions of people. They have their flaws, but they would certainly be much more amenable to people's interest being taken over. We have kept the implementation of this Biological Diversity Convention in the hands of the Antique Forest Department, which has not permitted any forward movement. Next slide, please. So, but India was committed to enacting a Biological Diversity Act as a follow-up of this convention. And Dr. M.S. Swaminathan was chairing the committee to draft the act, and I was a member. And we followed what the convention had in fact prescribed, that every local body, panchayats, the taluk panchayats, the gram taluk, jilla panchayats, all will constitute a biodiversity management committee for the purpose of promoting conservation, sustainable use, and documentation, but documentation to aid promoting conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. Now, FD, Forest Department, captured this implementation, and as I said, formulated rules which took away the management function of the Biodiversity Management Committee, which violated the intellectual property rights of people over folk knowledge, and today the Biodiversity Act has become a charade, and this should be something this should be changed. Next slide, please. And so we must look at them. We are talking about the whole spectrum of biodiversity. What is really destroying biodiversity on a large scale? What is destroying biodiversity today in India on a large scale is clearly pollution and habitat modification. And indeed, this is what is being actually promoted. It is not the hunting of birds and mammals that are the most important drivers of loss of biodiversity. That is what we are still talking about, whereas we are indeed, now recent last year's EIA notification further gave license to the red category, the worst polluting industry, to go on polluting without any supervision. And of course, habitat modification is going apace. We are having huge building spree of roads, highways, and this recent Konkan disaster. I have friends in Chittoor who have been telling me that it is the highway running, the West Coast highway running, and the whole lot of buildings which are encroached on the wetlands of Chittoor, which are responsible for the tragedy in Chittoor today. And not just that, there is this chemical industries complex at Lote upstream of Chittoor, and the polluted water in Vashishti River from this complex is actually part of what has flooded Chittoor. And I know a lady there who is a veterinary doctor with the government. She is telling me that livestock are dying by drinking this polluted water which is today flooding Chittoor. And this is what is being encouraged. Next slide, please. And with this encouragement, indeed, the common people are equating environmental protection with further stranglehold of forest department, because everybody is telling them that it is the forest department which will protect the environment, and they know what forest department and the governmental agencies are doing. So they are against environmental protection. I have a lot of experiences of this with the Western Ghati College expert panel report. Although we talked about empowering people and conserving the broader range of biodiversity, they said, those who wanted this report rejected, used as a major propaganda plank the idea that any acceptance of our report would be only further stranglehold of the forest department. And so people are against it in large measure because of this disinformation campaign. And who is profiting are, of course, the polluting industry, the mine and quarry operators, real estate lobby, forest-based industry, and netas and babus who are sharing their ill-gotten gains. Next slide, please. Just one example of a major landslide in Kerala at Puthumala, which killed a large number of people. That the people killed were tea estate laborers. As I said, the estate owners have treated them worse than slaves. They were forced to live in gullies, in miserable huts, and the landslide covered by 6 foot of mud the entire tea estate settlement at Puthumala. Next slide, please. So we must now turn around, change the system. It is the people, as I said, there is abundant evidence that before the British takeover and complete destruction of our forest and later our wildlife, it was the people who had been protecting it. Of course, the shining examples are these Bishois, who I've been to Bishnoi settlements in Rajasthan in Jodhpur district, and in a completely treeless landscape. The Bishnoi villages are green islands because they have protected their khejdi trees, which they consider as sacred trees, and in the village are roaming freely these antelopes and peafowl, and Mr. Salman Khan was tempted, of course, to take advantage of these antelopes. He shot as early as 1998 some antelopes, and Bishnois caught him red-handed, but he is today roaming free. If you kill a wild pig, you damage in your park, the Forest Department and the Wildlife Protection Act will promptly put you in jail. But Salman Khan, who was caught red-handed and in fact held guilty by the Jodhpur High Court in 1998, is still roaming free. And his fans are cursing the Bishnois for subjecting their great hero to all this torture. So, what the answer is very clear. Today also, in Goa, there is a railway line passing through Mallam Wildlife Sanctuary, and FD Forest Department is keeping quiet. It is the people of Goa which have tried to stop this railway line. In Madhya Pradesh, as much as 40% of reserve forests, the forest department itself proposed to be given over to industry, to be clear cut and to be converted into industrial plantations. Of course, badly destroying the habitat of wildlife and badly impacting wildlife. It is the people of Madhya Pradesh who forced the Chief Minister not to agree to this forest department proposal. So it is very clear that as a scientist and as a nature lover, my take home lesson is very clear. We must hand over the protection of the nature back to people at grassroots. We have appropriate machinery, legal machinery and machinery of democratic decentralized institutions, which are not functioning as they should, no doubt. But the official machinery of conservation is surely functioning far worse, and we must now bring back the people to take center, to come to the center stage for conserving biodiversity and including wild birds and mammals. As I said, you go to these bush-dwelling villages and see these chinkaras and black buck roaming free, and the chinkaras even entering houses. This lady is holding them, petting them and protecting them. So they will protect them, and that is the direction in which we must move, and that, to my mind, is the appropriate scientific approach to conserving biodiversity. Thank you very much for this opportunity to put these ideas. There is one more slide. Yeah, and where is wildlife abundant? Perhaps the most abundant, in Australia unique at the moment, most abundant we know objectively, evidence that wildlife is most abundant in Sweden and Norway. And I have had the pleasure of visiting many times Sweden and Norway because they are interested in the whole range of issues of wildlife protection, and they have been kindly inviting me. And I have enjoyed, I am an avid meat eater, moose steak with my Norwegian and Swedish friends. Of course, they hunt moose, but with proper restraint. And they have these big freezers full of moose. They are huge envelopes. And reindeer also. And mooses and deer. Anyway, so they have these huge freezers full of moose meat. They said they have some quota of 1 or 2, and they are enjoying very good moose steaks around the year. So that, and they say that wildlife is a renewable resource. We must put it to wise use, including through hunting. And I don't see why in India also we should not do this. We must do this, beginning with, of course, hunting wild pigs. We do not want immediately to think of other big animals, but wild pigs certainly. And that is how we should go. So Indian Sasana Niti talks about 4 ways of governance. Sama, Dama, Danda, Ved. In India, we are exclusively running governance, at least of the biodiversity, through Danda, the Danda of Forest Department, and Veda, to dividing people. There are plenty of examples of Forest Department deliberately pits people against people to ensure that they do not act unitedly. And what we should turn to is Sama and Dam, to understand people, to reward them, and not give up this Danda and Ved. Thank you very much. I will conclude there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Gadgil. Prachi?
Yes, thank you so much, sir. It was a wonderful session, and we are open to questions now. Participants can type in their questions in the chat box.
I think there are already two.
Yeah, there are already.
You can read them out for Professor Gadgil.
Yes, so we have two questions actually from Mr. Chirag, and he is asking that first question is, among the multiple serious threats to India's biodiversity, where does climate change stand?
Asha. Climate change, I think, certainly is a serious threat to Indian environment in many ways. And the intensive rates that we are witnessing today, in part at least, are due to this climate change component, though there are other complicating factors. Not only is there global climate change, which is impacting, but local aerosol concentrations are important. When there are high levels of local aerosol concentration, there is good evidence that that leads to very intense rainfall over a relatively shorter period. And what are these aerosols? The aerosols come from burning of coal, from rock quarries, and India is abounding in coal-fired power plants and the increasing number of rock quarries for all these highways and buildings. So-called man-made sand is made, which produces very fine aerosol particles. So that is probably also intensifying local rainfall. So we have both things. And then, of course, the Arabian Sea is getting heated up, and heating up of the Arabian Sea and rising the level are leading to new phenomena. There is some friends of mine from Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology that have recently published a paper showing that the frequency of cyclones of high intensity has been increasing over the last 20 years in the Arabian Sea, and actually little declining in the Bay of Bengal, and the two high, really super cyclones we had, Nisarga and this year's Taukte, are outcome of that. And those are certainly a major threat to our coastline. And amongst other things, we should make sure that there is not the kind of construction there is today on the coastline everywhere. So there are many of these lessons, and they relate to biodiversity because the traditional protection of the coastline by mangroves and by these Hindu trees, the mast wood trees, which protected the coastline, is being increasingly removed. And those are issues. So certainly there are biodiversity related effects also of climate change.
Thank you, sir. There is second question by the same person. And the question is, many solutions routinely propounded to address climate change, say like vast solar or wind farms, may often be illegal to local ecology. Could you share your thoughts on how best we can simultaneously address both the climate and the ecological crisis?
No, I must look at these particular examples, but I have written on my understanding, and to my understanding, the most important steps are A, of course, stop entirely coal-based power production. We are further and further increasing it, and there is now abundant evidence that solar power is actually economically also competitive with coal power. So there is no justification for that. So that is one major issue, which is favorable to biodiversity and which will combat climate change. And secondly, on the coast, certainly to not allow further destruction and re-establish the mangroves and this protecting covering of the Indi trees, which existed. There is good evidence that before the British takeover, the entire Arabian Sea coast had mangroves almost everywhere and had these very tall Indi trees protecting the coast from storms. The mast Indi or the mastwood trees were very good for masts of the ships. And for the British shipping at that time, sailing ships in 1820s and so on, all these trees were destroyed. Those can be put back. To reconstitute all this, one can create employment and give good, both ecologically productive and economically desirable employment to rural people. That is what I will immediately say. There may be other measures being suggested, which I would like to understand what they are. I immediately don't.
So, in the interest of time, can we take one more question?
No, I have abundant time. It is you who should regulate how much time.
Okay. So we have a question by Aditi Kare, and she's asking that many times there is an argument for development projects in some part will be lost, but what about ecological integrity? Is there a provision for ecological integrity in our legal system? And if not, will having one help?
No, there are good laws. See, there is pollution control law. There is environmental impact assessment law. You look at their actual implementation. The problem is that these environmentally desirable and also desirable for people at the ground level, these are not being implemented at all. They are being sabotaged. That is the problem. We have legal framework. The problem is not a lack of legal framework. The problem is lack of implementation of many of the laws.
Yes. Thank you so much, sir. Maybe we can take one last question. And this is by Kritika Kane. So she's saying that as you mentioned about polluted water that flooded Chittoor, which has affected the livestock diversity, does that water also affect the crocodiles and other aquatic flora currently present in Vashishti River? Are there any cases recorded with respect to aquatic fauna destruction over there?
With the Vashishti River, actually, I spent time and I know a lot of people at the grassroots. So there is one Prakash Parthi who is one of the leading members of the fishing community of Vashishti River. Once they were flourishing fisheries, and he has created evidence, both book level evidence, but also got some scientists to cooperate and prepare material of out of some 45 species of fish which were abundant before this Vashishti became polluted. Only some 5 now are abundant. Others have been wiped out. But closer to Pune, Dr. Sanjay Kharath, who is the principal of Madhav Gadgil here, who is a very good fish biologist, he has looked at our Ujni Dam on the Bhima River near Baravati, and actually he has documented that there also the same kind of thing. There is a huge decline in fish diversity, and of course, along with that, the huge negative impact of the livelihoods of the fishing community.
So we are getting a lot of questions, but in interest of time, we would have to stop. So thank you so much, sir. It was a wonderful session. On behalf of Pune Knowledge Cluster, I thank you for accepting our invitation and coming here for the wonderful talk and enlightening us with all the news about biodiversity. Thank you so much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Gadgil. Thank you so much. Okay, right.
मीटिंग स्टॉप झाली. स्टॉप होऊन जातं.
आता बोलू शकतो ना आपण.
स्टॉप नाही झालं.